Agroecology and its role in helping reduce emissions from agriculture. Farmers are often at the front line of climate change, feeling the effects of extreme weather and unpredictable weather as well, but they can also be part of the solution as well. So hopefully we'll explore that in this session. This session is brought to you by WWF and with support of the Soil Association, so we thank them very much for their contribution to this. I will welcome our panel shortly. We have two in the room, but we'll have also some people joining us down the line. But first of all, we're going to start with 3 short videos. They each are about 2 minutes long each, but they come from farmers in Scotland who are already practicing agroecology. So for those who aren't aware of what it is, an opportunity to learn a bit more about it. So we'll run these 3 videos. They'll take no more than 6 minutes, so settle in, grab some popcorn, and we're going to run these videos now.
My name's Nikki Oxel and I run Grampian and Graziers with my husband James. We're based in the north of Scotland and we would consider ourselves to be agroecological farmers. And that means that we farm using natural processes, we think about the farm as an ecosystem, but we also consider the wider social element of our farming practice, wanting to engage and nourish our community, but also working with other farmers locally. Agroecology is really important to us, and one way that we utilise this approach is through agroforestry, which means the intentional integration of livestock and woodland. We manage to do that on quite a lot of our grazing, but sometimes we're grazing areas like this, which is more conventional grassland. So we take a tall grass grazing approach here, and that means that we let the grass get nice and tall so that it creates lots of habitat for others. Really hope that during this period that leaders and thinkers from across the world can consider a broader approach to natural capital, how we can take into account the massive benefit that livestock can bring to our countryside and how they help us to create really interesting habitats, and not only think around greenhouse gas emissions. And I really hope that we see some very strong commitments about ending fossil fuel use with a clear timeline for phasing it out as we go forward.
Hi there, my name is Denise Walton. I'm here at Pelham Farm in the southern Scottish borders. We are a family farm. We farm certified organic and pasture for life. We've been on an agroecological farming trajectory, if you like, for the last 30 years. My background is as an ecologist, and the idea always has been to farm with nature.
For us, farming agroecologically has been about restoring habitat infrastructure. When we took Pelham on, it was overgrazed, intensively farmed, no fences. So restoring hedgerows, bringing in smaller fields in order for us to farm in a mixed farming manner has been key to building our farm assets. This was a forage crop. We cut it in June. We've undersown it with grass. There's been no ploughing, no tilling, simply grass stitched through this really plant species rich cover, which include something like 25 different species. This field has had no agrochemicals for over 20 years. No glyphosate, no nitrate, no phosphate, no potash, and it's productive.
Farming agroecologically has also meant fattening our beef on grass only. So an important aspect there as a farmer is that we've reduced our input costs. So no concentrate feed for our beef, no grain for our beef. So reducing inputs is part of the win-win solution of agroecological farming.
This here is a field of deferred grassland. It was a field that was cut for silage and then left ungrazed, but will be grazed in January, February by our cows before they calve. Not only is this a lot of photosynthesizing green biomass absorbing carbon and drawing the carbon into the soil, but also the roots will open the soil structure. So it's doing a number of jobs. It's maintaining soil structure and it's absorbing carbon.
Hello, I'm Johnny Balfour from Balboni Home Farms, and we are in the Kingdom of Fife in Scotland. We are a mixed farm with cattle, like you see behind me, and cereal crops, vegetable crops, and a little bit of forestry. And agroecology to us means looking after our ecosystem while producing food, fibre or fuel. An example of an agroecological practice that we use on the farm would be mob grazing. Behind me there are 70 cows and 70 calves, and they are eating a small paddock in this bigger field for one day, and then they will get moved on to fresh grass tomorrow. By using this practice, we are able to grow more grass, and we have been able to eliminate all synthetic inputs onto our grass system. What we're trying to do is to increase the rest periods, because the grass only grows when it's being rested. The reason that we wanted to implement mob grazing was to save money. It's cheaper to grow grass by moving cattle about in a particular way than it is to put fertilizer on it. And it's cheaper to feed a cow standing in a field than it is to feed a cow silage standing in a shed. My unreasonable hopes for COP26 are that world leaders realise what good land management can do for our environment when the wrong disincentives are taken away and farmers and other land users are able to do the right thing.
So hopefully you've got a better sense from those little videos about what agroecology is and how it integrates either with organic or conventional farming. I'm now going to introduce the panel. We have two panelists in the room, and hopefully on the video we'll be able to, or on the screen, be able to see our other two panelists. So in the room, on my far left is John Mwangi, who owns his own farm in Kenya and also teaches techniques of eco-farming and has demonstration plots, which we'll hopefully hear about. He's also the chair of an organisation called the Network for Eco-Farming in Africa. Welcome, John. Then we have Lorna Slater, who many of you know is the Scottish Government Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity. Welcome, Lorna. And on the screen, hopefully we should now have if I can see them, Renat Kunast, who's a member of the Bundestag for Alliance of 90s Greens. She was the Minister for Consumer Protection, Food and Agriculture, and is part, and this week in fact, yesterday, has been part of the Green negotiating team on agriculture for the new government coalition, and in fact just handed in their coalition agreements to party leaders yesterday, so we'll hear maybe some of that. And then we have James Owen, who's the Welsh Deputy Director of Landscapes, Nature and Forestry, who's standing in for the Minister who could not join us at the last minute. So thank you, welcome to you all. So let me start with John here in the room, and then I'll work through all the panellists on this question, which is, what do you see as the role of agroecology in your country, and what's happening now?
Thank you so much. And we're farming in Kenya, organic farming. We find it's very important because of especially the preservation of the bees, because when you use the pesticides you kill the bees, and we usually have good yields when you have the bees pollinate. You have a good health and from the consuming of the good crop.
Thank you. Rana, I'm going to come to you now. Are you able to say a little bit about the role of you see for agroecology in Germany, and tell us what's actually happening there at the moment? Renat, can you hear me? Can you maybe say a little bit about the role of agroecology in Germany?
Hello, Renata. Yes, sorry. It was not so easy to listen. I hope you get me in acoustically well. Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you for the invitation and to give you a little impression on agroecology and what we are doing in Germany now. You see, I think in this group, I do not have to explain agroecology and what are the benefits. I'm convinced that the benefit is that not only because of climate and biodiversity, it's also important that we do not only focus on more organic farming. Why? Because we would say, despite of the fact that we German Greens try to convince the new government to say 30% organic farming until 2030. But, you know, we have to try hard to reach that because we cannot force farmers to change. But beside that, it's always very important not only to focus on the percentage of organic farming, but also to make conventional farming more organic, which means, for example, reduce animal husbandry. Some people say we have to halve the amount of animals we have, agricultural animals we have until 2035. I think that is right. But it's also the point that for all the other parts of agriculture, we have to do change without forcing people to go to organic farming. That is why so important, because it gives us the possibility to reach out to all the other hundreds and tens of thousands of hectares to come into a change and more biodiversity, more fighting against climate change. I think this is one extremely important point. And what I think is due to a new German government, or even on the EU level, is to change every part of our rules and subsidies. And in every point, you know, to have two aspects. The one is, how do we better subsidize as far as we subsidize and do not get rid of this money for other parts? If and where we subsidize, we have to try to change the system so that, you know, more than 30% of the most of the eco schemes of we are delivering here, that they have the hard facts of ecological farming, and that can be used for people that go the way for certified farming, ecological farming, but also for the other part. We have to make it the change. We have to support the change by the money, because otherwise we will not succeed. You know, you can go for the discussion: is it right to pay someone stopping to harm nature or climate, as we do it with the CO2 price, where we say, you know, you have to pay, you know, if you pollute, you see. But on this part, we have to ask, how do we get food security, the amount of vegetables and so on we need, beside the problem of too much or not enough rain or sun and something, and how do we, in a very, you know, in a short time, bring people to change their habits and how they do agriculture on their enterprise. And that is why the first big step, as always, to say we have to change the money. And this is why we say and try to say that this period of the common agricultural policy in Europe, and then after the next, the subsidies should be totally changed. There should not be direct payments, but you know, facts and criteria you can follow, you get points for it. And if you, for example, do agroforest or hedges or change the fruits on your acre and all the things, and we always have a system of points. And on this point, you get for your work, for common interests, climate, biodiversity, so then you get subsidies. And I think this must be the goal. This is a practical way, the practical way to get a change in the next time. And let me add one sentence. All this way, trying to change the systems, the rule, the criteria for subsidies, more on the criteria of agroecology. You also have to go with the cities and the consumers. We need a change in public procurement and all this public feeding, you know, schools, kindergartens, universities, canteens of hospitals. So we have to focus on changing there. There must be the demand for more organic products and so on, because we only get the change to agroecology if, on the other hand, the farmers see this is what the people will buy. And it's not a question of us as individuals also. But the first point is to show there are tons of vegetables asked. The first point is to have all this public scene and outside dining from school, kindergarten, and canteens and restaurants. We have to change there.
Thank you for that. And we'll probably come on to talk about some of the support mechanisms in a moment, so thank you. Lorna, we had some really great videos of what's happening already in Scotland. What do you see now in your ministerial role as the role of agroecology playing in Scotland in the future?
So after transportation, our land use is our greatest opportunity in Scotland for cutting our carbon emissions, but also for sequestering carbon and for tackling the biodiversity crisis. So agroecology, I can say it, agroecology has an enormous role to play, and it's very exciting to see the videos that we saw this morning, farmers who are making, having a good example, showing what can work, demonstrating these techniques, and that's what I hope we can do in government, is support farmers to do that. Our German colleague talked about subsidies. The Scottish Government has committed that 50% of the CAP subsidies will be based on environmental criteria. So the job now is to decide, as the farmer said in the video, how to incentivize behavior that we want to reach our biodiversity goals, but also will make sure that our farmers prosper in Scotland.
Thank you. And now I'm going to come to you, James. What's the situation in Wales, and what role do you see for agroecology in Wales?
Prynawn da pawb, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. For us in Wales, we want to incentivise and support our farmers to transition to a system of sustainable farming, which recognises the triple importance of producing food sustainably with the responses that we must make to the climate and nature emergencies. And to do that, we believe incentivising them by directing our support away from the basic payment and the direct payment schemes of the Common Agricultural Policy, to incentivise them to undertake actions on their farm which will deliver the environmental outcomes that we're seeking, such as clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, improved habitat management. And it's heartening to see that many of the practices that the farmers demonstrated in the videos earlier are exactly the types of actions that we want farmers in Wales, or we want to encourage farmers in Wales to undertake. The key difference for us is that we will effectively pay farmers for those actions in the future, recognising that they deliver significant social and environmental benefits, whilst also can provide, as I think Johnny said, many of the economic benefits to farmers themselves by reducing their input costs. So we're beginning that transition. We've consulted a number of times on our proposals, and we're seeking, as I say, to move our subsidy regime from the CAP subsidy regime from 2024 onwards.
I'm going to stay with you, James, for this next question, which again I'll put to all the panellists, which is, we heard a little bit from that about the support systems they're talking about in Germany, but what's your thoughts in addition to the changing the subsidy regime, about what support you would offer farmers in Wales to move to this type of farming?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it's not just about the financial incentive of transitioning to this farming, but it's also the knowledge transfer and innovation that we can provide from government to support that transition. So supporting farmers changing their practices can take many forms. Supporting education where that's helpful, but also supporting that peer-to-peer learning. So looking over the hedge, so to speak, at practices that other farmers are doing in Wales, and then taking them, adopting them, on their own farm can make the difference. So supporting farmers in Wales financially, but also through the provision of knowledge transfer and innovation. And I think innovation is a really interesting point here, whether it's the better use of technology to support the farming practices we're talking about, or indeed, further research into the kind of potential for reducing emissions for things like feed, and supporting farmers to make the most of that innovation is another key integral part of what we're trying to do here in Wales.
Thank you. Johnny, you talked about knowledge transfer then. That sounds exactly what you're doing with your farm. Do you want to say a little bit about what support you think you need to see in Kenya to support more farmers such as yourself start to practice agroecology?
First of all, we find the extension of the agriculture officers who are there, they don't really helping farmers very much, and when they come on now with the NGO partnership, that's when now they come into the farmers and try to support them in education, and also showing them training and having let me say, sorry. also the government is helping farmers making the roads more accessible to the market, because you find a farmer is having a produce and is not able to reach the market, and also maybe trying to conserve the government also try to support farmers, maybe establishing a collection of milk and also making coolants for milk, so that when they produce the milk, they don't waste it on a rainy day or something like that.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's many different ways that farmers in your country could be supported to actually start to go down this, cooperatives and infrastructure as well. Lorna, what's the thoughts about how we, beyond the subsidies in Scotland, can help support farmers move into transition into agroecology?
It's a really interesting question. So my portfolio of green skills, circular economy and biodiversity actually touches on agriculture under all three areas. You might think it was just the biodiversity area, but there is the green skills element, and as John has said about the skills sharing, for example, around things like using non-pesticide control measures. Those are techniques and skills that we need to share and learn so that we can, choose our use of pesticides very carefully and use alternative control measures where they're available. But also on the circular economy piece, something that we talk about a lot is nitrogen wastage in our system. That's why we have to add fertilizers in, because then the nitrogen gets lost out of the system. So as the farmers in the videos were saying, if you can keep the nitrogen in your system naturally, then you don't need to add it back in, which not only saves cost, but is better for biodiversity. So the kind of support mechanisms that could be offered are things like soil testing, so that farmers can see how well they're doing, see how well their soils are storing nitrogen, and try out different techniques, because every bit of land is a little bit different and will require a different technique. So those kind of things are how the government can help support. So talking of government, Renat, you've just been trying to sort out a coalition agreement. What was in the agreement, and what are you trying to do with regards to put in those support structures? You kind of touched upon some of them, but I'd be particularly interested, was there anything in the coalition agreement documents that you were seeking to in the way to support farmers?
Yes. Sorry, I'm not allowed to tell you what is inside our papers. We are in the middle of do have a clear advice that we don't tell details from our talks, because we don't want to struggle publicly between three parties before we are finished with all this. But I can tell you one thing, what we try to go to. It's a bit like my first part I had here a few minutes ago. We really try to go on some different point, on the point of agriculture change and in the way of farming, and what do we support by public money, especially animal husbandry. So the second part is pesticides, how to reduce. It's a big point, even in a debate between us and the parties, and we are not ready on that point, because there are different ways of thinking. Three parties, of course, different ways of thinking. And what we think is that we, as Greens, that we only can succeed with climate and biodiversity if we really have a line, a goal we want to reach. And my point is that I think that the Green Deal of the European Union saying that 50% reduction of pesticides until 2030 is a point. This should be written there. And only if we write that, then we can implement the mechanism and steps on this, because we force ourselves to reach this goal. And I don't have to explain you how important it is. And the other point is this, public feeding. You have to organize that people are buying it, and that are good. There are good contracts for the farmers where they can say, okay, this is a perspective. I'm not, on the retailer changing my income every year or every month. And very insecure situation, we have to give them a perspective, because otherwise we'll have a lot of people that invest in agriculture because they have too much money, and soil and ground is something interesting, but we do not have living livelihoods in rural areas, so on, and we forget and lose all practicing. We cannot go to circular economy also if we do not look at these even little farms or medium-sized farms with real families living in rural areas and that are interested. And this is also an important point, you know, I think we have to go the way that we have a label and a sign where we can see how the animals are kept. We need a label to see where the things come from, and we have to start better and get more information on the ecological footprint, you see. And let me say one thing, which I think we should not go a wrong way. It's always okay to say innovation, but everyone who is talking about robotics, drones, and all these things, and precision farming or carbon farming, a nice word, but only on a theoretical level now, carbon farming. We cannot, it's not enough to talk about this and write this down somewhere. Why? Because no one can tell us what the result will be. If I say we have, you know, if I would say you have 1 hectare more organic farming next spring, then I can say this is what, you know, what this starts to change. But looking on robotics or even better and better machines is nice to have. It's good, not bad. But do you get the machines you want today? Does it help little farmers? No. And if you try to order a machine or robotics or whatever, you don't get it. They say, okay, in a few years. And even then, we do not know exactly how much harm to climate or biodiversity we reduce in this. So let us implement innovation, but innovation is not only software, modern machines, and so on. Innovation is to learn from our own past. How do we deal together with nature? And even to do science on this, you know, it makes sense that some agricultural practices were there. And if we want to keep, you know, this farm really on and, you know, and really keep and protect our areas, it's for Europe, but also for Africa, for example, then we have to focus in all techniques we use, we have to focus on the situation we have. And for Africa, for example, all this robotics and so on or in Asia, will not help people to feed themselves. Then we have to go on agroecology or on organic farming, and then we need the innovation to find out which seeds do we already have, or do we keep protecting the varieties for future times? What techniques and knowledges do we have, like Sikkim, for example? I think, you know, going organic, we have to teach and educate and help the people and do selling structures. Because we know that these
so I think clear that innovation doesn't always mean machinery and technology, so we maybe come on to that. I'm really keen to now hear from the 3 individuals who were featured in the videos. They have some questions they would like to put to the panelists, so hopefully they're going to come up on screen. So the first person I'm going to go to is Denise. Denise, you had a question. Over to you.
Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so my question really is about the relationship between agroecology, biodiversity, and climate change. There are often discussions about whether biodiversity really makes a difference to climate change. And in my view, well, it'd be good to hear from the panel what they think, and then maybe I can share what I think about it. But it's really whether you feel that biodiversity is an important factor from agroecology in terms of climate change.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to put that one to Johnny first, if I may. So the question it was, so how there's the aspects of biodiversity in farming and agroecology, and as opposed to just climate change. How important is the nature piece, the biodiversity piece, in your work, or just generally, how important should it play a role?
Hello. I think when we go farm organic, and that time we change the soil texture, and it makes even the soil to be sipping water, and you don't have runoffs. So by avoiding runoffs, we don't lose soil fertility.
Yeah, Lorna?
So as a Green, this is something I feel very strongly about. That we consider them the twin crises. And this is something the Scottish Government has acknowledged as well. The climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis go together. In Scotland in particular, our biodiversity status is very poor. We have a very low bio-intactness index. Our land is very damaged. And that's because of centuries of human use of the land. It's not something that's recent necessarily. But in the last 30 years, since we've been trying to do something about it, the biodiversity of Scotland has been damaged reduced by 24%. That's while we've been trying to do something about it. That's a devastating loss. You know, I would be upset if it was a 5% loss, but 24% is enormous. And when we say loss of biodiversity, we mean loss of animal species, but also loss of tree species, loss of species at sea. And we know that, you know, creatures in the sea, for example, they make their shells out of calcium carbonate. That's an enormous amount of carbon that is sequestered in our seas if our seas are healthy. When we grow trees and when we have mixed wood forests and so on, we sequester a lot of carbon. And healthy peatlands not only allow animal diversity but plant diversity and do the carbon sequestration. So that's how the biodiversity piece fits in with the climate piece, is that we need healthy nature. We need Mother Nature to be healthy, to take that carbon out of our atmosphere. And this is desperately dangerous, and this is what this COP is all about. That there is already enough carbon in our atmosphere to drive global heating past 3 degrees. So what we have to do is stop putting carbon into the atmosphere and pull out of the atmosphere a lot of the carbon that's already there. And that does involve changing our land use. It does involve planting more trees. It means having healthy soil. Healthy soil can absorb a lot of carbon. It means having healthy seas. It means having healthy peatlands. And so that's how the biodiversity piece comes together, is that those healthy nature spaces have very diverse amounts of plants, animals, and insects in those spaces. And in some ways, for example, the animals and the insects, the bees that John's talking about, are the metrics, the measures we can use of how healthy our land is.
Thank you. I'm going to come to James on this question as well, and then we'll take another question. James.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I couldn't agree with Lorna more, really. The approach Welsh Government has taken is similar. We've declared both a climate and a nature emergency, and therefore our solutions around land management use of the future need to be focused on giving us a pathway to reverse both of the challenges of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. And just perhaps give one example of where we think land use change can do both and deliver a multiplicity of outcomes.
Can you kill? I'm sorry, James. I have to interrupt you. There was a real interference in the line. We'll maybe try and sort that out and come back to you. Apologies, you were just really breaking up. I think we'll take a question now from Nikki, who was one of the farmers. So, Nikki, I think you've got a specific question about Scotland. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a question really for Lorna. And whilst you've mentioned the 50% of subsidy having a conditionality attached, I'm interested in what commitment there is to develop an agroecology, a very explicit agroecology strategy for. I think I was just muted, sorry, by somebody else. Could you hear me okay? Okay. I'm interested in what commitment there is to develop an explicit agroecology strategy for Scotland. Someone else keeps muting me, apologies. I'm going to stop, I think.
A thumbs up if I've got this. Is this working now? Yep. You can give me a thumbs up if this, nope. Hello. Ah, there we are. You can give me a thumbs up if I've got this right. I think you were asking about a biodiversity strategy in Scotland. Is that what you? No, that's not. I misheard. Never mind.
No.
Try again.
I think it was something along the lines of what commitment is there to develop an agroecology strategy in Scotland?
Okay.
I see you nodding head there. Okay.
So I'm not the agriculture minister. I'm the Minister for Biodiversity. So I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I'm happy to go and find out about that question. In terms of biodiversity strategy, we'll be developing one this year for it to be delivered next October. And of course, as I say, that touches on so many pieces. It touches on the agriculture piece as well as marine life, our life in our cities and everything around those areas. But I'm happy to go away and find out about the agrocultural piece.
Okay, we'll stick with questions from in here just now, but we will try and come back to all of you online. One thing that was touched upon is about the need for involvement of communities and people. So I'd be keen to hear both from Johnny and from Lorna about how do we ensure the transition to agroecology and a sustainable food system is a just and fair one? How do we, as we go towards net zero in our agricultural system, how do we make sure that's a fair system? Maybe Lorna, you want to offer us some thoughts on that first.
Absolutely. I mean, there's already some excellent work being done. The Farming for 1.5 report is an excellent report that's been put together by farmers about how they want to go about tackling it. There's some excellent recommendations in there that we in government should be taking on board. I mean, that's how we do it. There are, as we've seen in the videos, farmers that they know what they're doing. They know how to do this. What we need to do is support them to share that knowledge throughout the industry as well. And it's something that someone like myself who's sitting in government needs to go out and learn about. We need to go and look at the farms and see what people are doing and find out what the best practice is so we can support that.
Okay, Johnny, I mean, maybe the just transition can be different in different countries. What's your view of how in Kenya that this transition that you need to see can be one that's good for communities, good for farmers? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, our government is really trying to place at least you have 10% of your portion of land on trees. So like myself now, I already have 11 acres on trees because my land is 90 acres. So with that, encourage now the environment also in reducing the carbon by planting more trees. That's a government initiative.
So you're saying in Kenya there's actually a government, all farmers have to plant 10% of their land with trees?
Yes, the government is really pushing on that. All farmers have to have 10% of land on trees. If you have 5 acres, then 5% of it should have trees.
And how is that going down? I mean, is this something you're already doing or you're working towards? And how is this viewed by farmers? Do they welcome this? Do they get support to do it?
Yes, they are doing it because if we have NGOs which are encouraging having the seedlings which are supplied to the farmers and also in schools. Because then school children are also planting the trees.
Okay, I think we maybe see if we can get James maybe to check if the lines are working. If it's not, we'll give it a go. But James, maybe your thoughts on how we support farmers and farming communities to transition to this.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hopefully you can hear me, and apologies for any issues at the previous end. For us.
No, I think we're going to have to kill that. I'm really sorry because I was keen to get the questions in. So I think I'm going to have to take some of the questions that are coming in from individuals online. There was a question, and maybe it's partly related to one of the answers gave, but which comes first, the transition to agroecological farming or the transition to climate and nature-friendly diets, or are they have to go hand in hand? Lorna, your thoughts?
Well, I think they absolutely have to go hand in hand. I have no question about it.
Johnny?
Yeah, may I say an answer to that? Hello?
I mean, often you have in countries, you have farming and agriculture is not necessarily always connected with the food ministries, and they kind of battle out, or health ministries because of diet. I mean, what would be, I guess, Lorna, your thoughts of what the setup is in Scotland just now?
Thank you for your cooperation.
And for all those online, we were sitting down. So anyway, do you want to maybe give us your thoughts about kind of how government is set up with its departments, how this could be made to work? It's about the connection between whether or not the agricultural and moving to agroecological types of farming. Do you need to do that first, or do you have to do it hand in hand with changing our diets and making our diets more sustainable too?
You're right that we need to have a think about, on a sort of societal level, how we're going to approach this. In this term of Parliament, we'll bring forward a Good Food Nation bill, which addresses some of these thoughts. How do we feed ourselves? How do we reduce our carbon footprint for our food? How do we make sure that everybody has nutritious food? I know the Greens believe in the right to food, that all humans should have the right to food. So, there's a whole bunch of pieces there around human rights, around agriculture, around nutrition, around inequality. And that's something that some joined up thinking like the Good Food Nation bill would seek to address.
We were talking earlier on about subsidies. And how they're only part of it, but they're obviously a big part of it. I mean, it's hundreds of millions of pounds in Scotland alone. I don't know what the situation is in Kenya. I'd be maybe interested to hear about what role, John, you think subsidies have to. You maybe tell us what's the situation in Kenya to begin with regards to subsidies, and what role you feel future subsidies should play in this transition.
In Kenya, we don't usually have subsidies because we find farmers are really trying very much and producing, and they use a lot of funds in producing. And then the most challenging thing is that they also find the food being dumped in, and the yield the farmer gets has nowhere to go to sell it. They can't sell it because the price becomes too low. And though this farmer now ends up not being able to even sustain himself. So we don't usually have any help from any government.
Well, that's quite, from a European perspective, the idea that there's no subsidies kind of feels strange, and I'm sure lots of people who kind of worried about that. Lorna, hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money currently goes into agriculture. It sometimes, as we would say, it doesn't always go to the best places. But what's your thoughts about what needs to happen as we look to reform rural payments?
I mean, as I said at the beginning of this session, the Scottish Government has committed that 50% of the CAP payments going forward will have, conditions applied to it around the environment. But what we have yet to decide is what those conditions will be. So I expect that we will be consulting with farmers, like the farmers in the videos, to find out what works, what's effective, how localized the different things should be, because obviously all bits of land are different. We can't decree something at a national level that will work everywhere. So there's a good bit of work to go into how we get the most bang for our buck from that 50%. How do we make sure that that incentivizes and supports farmers to do the right thing for their land? And I think the big thing that everybody's talking about now in nature restoration is landscape scale change. So looking at entire river catchment basins, for example, and perhaps we can join these things up so that the subsidies in a particular area are connected to a particular project to support these either local nature networks or something like that. So, I mean, these are just some ideas I'm floating of the kind of conditionality that might be applied. But of course, within the government, the Scottish ministers and our officials will be working on that very closely over the next couple of years.
So just building on that, and this is questions coming in online, there's a recognition that the current government policy is to have half of money going that direction. Would you like it to go further? I mean, how can we be ambitious in transitioning? And do you think it's possible further? And if not, what are the barriers to going further than 50%?
I mean, 50% is where we are now. It's not something we've had before. It's something that's been done in other places, but it's where we are now. So to some extent, it's about how we can best use that and see how that goes. Does that help us turn the corner on this terrible biodiversity loss that we've had? Is that enough? So let's start there and see how well it goes, and then we can assess going forward if that is enough, or maybe there doesn't need to be more. Okay, given that we can't come to our farmers online, I've now got the question in from Johnny Balfour, which was, and I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is how can we in the privileged north learn from the underprivileged south about short supply chains, greater family responsibilities for growing food? So I'd be interested in your reflections on that, John, first. So how is it we in the north, what do we have to learn from what you and others are doing in your practices?
Learning on, I'm not getting your question. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, so the question is, how can we in the north learn from Kenya and other countries about our food supply system, short supplies, short supply chains, greater family involvement in farming and growing food? What do you have to offer to Scotland and nut farmers in Europe?
Oh, as we do practice the traditional way of farming, where you put back the manure, but we use the effective microorganism. This is technology from Japan, and we have beneficial microorganism, where you use this organism to prepare manure, which takes about 3 weeks or so, and then we put them back to the farm. And by so doing, now you keep on don't have a lot of inputs in the farm, and then at least you reduce the cost of production.
Yeah, I'm going to come to the audience in a second here, so be thinking about if you've got a question too, given that we can't quite take them from our friends down the line. But Lorna, your thoughts on that? What do we have to learn?
Well, I'm interested in what John said there. What I think you were talking about was what I would call circular economy. So you're using the manure from the farm and processing it so that it can then be used immediately. So rather than buying in fertilizer, you're processing what came off the farm to use again. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so I'd be interested to hear if that is the process that could be adapted to farms here, and if it sounds a bit like what the farmers in the video were doing, that sort of what I would call circular economy, but making sure that waste isn't really waste, that it's reused, that you recapture that into the system. So that would be a wonderful thing for us to learn here and do here.
Great, I think it's all about sharing and learning and transfer of knowledge. I have seen a couple of hands in the audience now, so I'm going to come to those, and I don't know if we've got have we got a spare microphone? In fact, there's one here, Kirsty. So if you could please raise your hands. I have spotted one, and I'll maybe try and come to. Okay, this info here. Thank you. If you could wait for the mic. Is it on? Should be a green light.
Hello. Do you want to take the mask off?
Up to you. Well, if you feel comfortable. If you could just say your name and if you represent an organisation, then ask your question, please.
Yeah, my name is Richard Bramley. I'm a farmer from Yorkshire in England. I'm also the National Farmers Union Environment Forum chair. I've been stood outside listening on the phone, about 20 seconds behind, which has been very interesting. And it is fascinating, and I'm entirely with the move to a more sustainable agricultural system. But this is a global event that we've got going on here. And as we look to move within Europe and the UK to that form of farming, totally with it. Don't like the word subsidy. I think incentivise is far better. We've got to remember that we're supplying a market. And if we're not careful, if that market production drops, we'll start to suck in imports. And one of the two terms I've learned, global north and global south, whilst I've been here. And a very interesting talk I was at last night talked about the economic system of extraction. How we've extracted from the poorer parts of the world to support our way of living here in Europe. So what I'm interested to know is how we make that transition in such a way that doesn't happen. And I'm particularly interested in your perspective, because I'm aware that Kenya has a very strong production system selling into Europe, flowers or fresh produce. And really, if you think about it, as much as that's economically extremely valuable to you, it hasn't got a long-term prospect. So I'm very interested to know what you believe is going to be the next stages for that, and how we transist in our world, in the global north, without impacting badly elsewhere. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for your question, John. Your thoughts on that?
Well, this flower farming are really affected Kenya because you find they go to an extent of even harvesting river water from the upstream and having the lower people not having enough water. And these are the ones who are the small-scale farmers. They are not able to access that water. So it's a really big problem where you have a lot of resources used in the flower farms, of which are not helping the Kenyans in food production. They are not able to put food on the table. So it's a really big challenge to us.
Thank you. I'm going to try once more online. Do we have a thumbs up to try? I'm looking at the folks in the booth. So I don't know, James, if you were listening to that question, I mean, and Lorna, I'll come to you if this doesn't quite work out, but of course, Scotland, like many other countries, has kind of often an export-driven part to their farming industry, and it'd be good to maybe, I don't know, James, if you heard the question in the audience, but hopefully you can maybe share your reflections on that question and thoughts.
Yeah, and hopefully you can hear me. So for us, I think, thinking about Wales being a globally responsible. Sorry, I don't know if I was muted.
No, I'm really sorry about that. We're really keen to it. So, Lorna, your thoughts?
You've asked one of the big questions, and I wish I did know what the answer is. No, because this is all of our concern. As John says that, the flower farms are damaging Kenya, meaning people can't feed their own feed their own families. That is very worrying. And then, we've got to get the right balance of imports and exports in Scotland. We've got to deal with the outcomes of Brexit and the risks to our farming here with our high food standards and our high quality of animal welfare standards. People with my line of politics feel that those are potentially at risk if we had to do a trade deal with America, for example. So these are big questions. How we feed ourselves, how we base our economy, how we manage our land. These are the big questions. So I don't have a quick answer for you on that, but they're exactly the kind of questions that we wrestle with every day, and that everyone is. So they're the right ones to be asking.
Yeah, and from a WF perspective, certainly it's something that we're very conscious of, both from working in Scotland, but also just as a global organisation. This idea of the interlinkages between farming and agriculture globally. It's a global market. Yes, there's supplies for domestic, but it's you just need to look at Scottish industry to know how much is exported, and there's a premium on that too. So there's an absolute drive for farmers to export as well, and it's often supported by government. But yeah, we need to make sure we work on that and we don't accidentally create problems, even if we're doing farming really well in our own country, that we aren't just simply creating problems elsewhere on that. I'm going to come to the audience again, so hopefully there is maybe a hand or a question that can come from folks here. No? Okay. I'll maybe take the quick. That's right. Please, if you could say your name and your question, and great if it's a question.
Hi, my name's Debbie Bassett. I work for Nature Scot, the government's nature agency in Scotland. One of the things that struck me when I've been speaking to farmers is the actual age of farmers. We've got an ageing farming population, and I'd be really interested to know, what do we do to encourage young people into farming? And I'd really like to know from John whether that's the same issue in Kenya.
Thank you. Good question. John?
Yeah, it happens in Kenya also. You find the old are the ones who are in the farms. And even training them is very difficult, because it comes a time they tell you that before you were born, you were still farming. So there was no way you're going to teach him in anything. So that's why we came up with the demonstration plots. So when you have your own farm and it's doing very well, this farmer now comes and asks a question. How did you go about it? Then that time you have a chance of training this farmer. But now for the young, we encourage them, because we go to schools and we have demonstration farms in schools. And we encourage the lower classes, especially the lower primary, to farm. And we make it like an enjoyable thing to do. So with them now, they take it as an exercise which they are enjoying doing it. And as we train them, they go back home and also tell their parents that we are not supposed to take this type of food. This is the one healthy food. So we are trying to encourage them that way.
Lorna.
There's a big piece here around renewing our rural spaces, our rural population. That's certainly a commitment from the Scottish Government to try and regenerate our rural communities, and a big part of that is about the jobs that we can create there. So under my portfolio, I have green skills, and one of the categories of green skills, one of the really big categories, is land restoration, and that would include regenerative farming, but also forestry, restoration of peatland, and all the kind of science and technology that goes around with that. So there's a huge piece about repopulating rural Scotland here, and what the future of rural Scotland looks like. I mean, there's so many issues around it in terms of housing availability, housing costs, but these are all issues that the Scottish Government is wanting to tackle, because there's enormous opportunities there. There are tens of thousands of good jobs in forestry, for example. Good jobs, well-paid jobs. And there are, the potential for the regenerative agriculture and that sort of land management and use is also enormous. So there are good jobs coming in these industries of the future, and we can encourage young people into them. But there's also the sort of just transition piece of mid-career change. So I'd like to support young people coming up through apprenticeships and education, but also mid-career people to change, and people who've been out of work for a while, maybe for medical reasons or for family reasons, to help support them to come back into these industries, because this is exactly the kind of green industry of the future. It's sustainable, it reduces our carbon footprint, there are good wages to be had, and these are the kind of jobs that our kids, grandkids, and their grandkids will have.
I'm really glad to hear the Minister say that. Having sat on the Scottish Just Transition Commission, there was a whole section on agriculture and land use, and when we heard evidence from farmers and farmers' representatives, it was very clear of that issue of the ageing population, and also the skills and knowledge and education of some of those individuals too. We really do need to find a way to help support farmers, as in the way Lorna is saying, and I'd recommend people reading the recommendations, and also it's good if you could read them too, Minister, of what we said in our commission. So I think there's a lot that can be followed up in there. We shouldn't forget our rural communities and farming communities in the role as we move to a net zero. Apologies to those online and to our other guests. I'm going to put the last question to Lorna. This is for you, Lorna, only. This has come from online. What does Lorna think her role is as Biodiversity Minister in better joining up with agriculture policy to secure nature and climate-friendly farming? So what do you see as your role, Minister?
So I see my role as being to the person who joins the dots, something that government is quite reasonably often criticized for, about being siloed. We look at agriculture over here, we look at industry over here, we look at transport over here, we look at biodiversity over here. And I think when the First Minister put my portfolio together, I think what she wanted was someone to sort of join those pieces together, because biodiversity covers not just agriculture, but also forestry, but also marine, also our cityscapes. So I think that that's my role, is as a facilitator, to work with the other ministers, to work with NGOs in all those spaces, to figure out how we can work together on the big pieces like biodiversity, because I do really believe that the biodiversity crisis is the second pillar of the climate crisis, and it is really such a privilege to have a role that means that all those pieces can be joined up. And it's a little bit daunting. It's a big role, but I'm glad to be doing it.
So I think very much on a sort of a global to local, it is about joining those dots. It's about innovation, as we heard from that. It's not just machinery and technology. It's innovation of mind, the sharing of knowledge, collaboration, and it's farming with nature, which is what we heard from one of our farmers as well. So I think, So I think the key thing I'd say is, well, thank you to our speakers here in the room, but also thank you to our other speakers who, unfortunately, due to technical issues, we weren't able to contribute to the latter half. So thank you for Renat, James, Denise, Nikki and Johnny, but hopefully you've had an opportunity here, get some of your questions answered by our panel here. So thank you very much, and that's all from us. Are we done, Dana? So thank you very much for that. So as I say, the Minister is about to be making a speech on a different topic. You're more than welcome to stay for that, should you wish. But if you wish to leave, then probably now is a good time to do so. And so thank you very much, John, for that. So.